It's weird because they don't so many people who are here. They'll probably have more intelligent things and helpful things to say about
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to get started, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming to today's discussion of demographic shifts and civil conflict. My name is Gib Clark. I'm the program associate with the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. A little bit about the Wilson Center for those of you who've never been here before. The Wilson Center was formed in 1968 as an official act of Congress to be the living memorial to our nation's 28th president. As Wilson was our only president to have earned a PhD, the Wilson Center strives to bring together the worlds of ideas and the worlds of policy. The Environmental Change and Security Program facilitates dialogue among the connections between population, health, the environment, and security issues. These issues are often complex and intertwined, so we're lucky to have Christian and Monica here today to help us dissect them a little bit. The Environmental Change and Security Program is pleased to be holding today's session with the assistance and collaboration of the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity, which is also here at the Wilson Center, chaired by former Congressman Howard Wolpe. Monica Duffy Toft will speak first. She is Associate Professor of Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Formerly, she was the Assistant Director of Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies, and she is the author of The Geography of Ethnic Violence and an edited volume, The Fog of Peace and War Planning. Christian Leuprecht is the Assistant Professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, a founding research fellow of the Center for Security, Armed Forces and Society, Vice Chair of Defense Management Studies, and a fellow at the Queen's Center for International Relations. His research focuses primarily on the political implications of demographic change. More information about both these speakers is available in the handout that you received when you walked in. And one final note before we begin, we are webcasting this session. So when we get to the question and answer, please wait for a microphone. We'll pass along a microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation so that those watching online know who you are and can hear you when you ask a question. So we'll start with Monica.
Okay, great. And thank you for sponsoring me and having me here, and especially Gib and Megan for organizing this session, and Christian for coming. Today I'm going to talk about three different aspects of demography and war, and then I'll get into my research, which actually looks at ethnic demographic transition. So it looks at the differential population growth rates among ethnic groups within states. And so first I'm just going to go through a brief history of the study of demography and war. I'm trained as an IR scholar, and I think that this is an area that's actually been understudied substantially in the field. Second, I'm going to look on contemporary research. So what questions are being asked, which are being answered, and how well at this point. And then third, issues and problems related to the study of demography and war, because I think that one of the reasons why demography from a political science, international relations, sociological perspective is understudied is that we have some serious data issues. And so I'll go through some of that, and then during Q&A we can discuss them at length. And given my expertise, most of the discussion is going to be on civil wars, and also most of the work today being done on demography is done at the sub-state level, and it's because most contemporary wars are at the sub-state level, and actually historically that's the case. 90% of large-scale political violence tends to be within states. So three questions: why demography and war, and why now? Why so little sustained study, and what evidence has shown so far in ethnic demographic transitions in civil war? What have we discovered so far? So why demography and why now? So at its root, the importance of the link between demography and war is the relative capacity of a given political unit's population to aid in its defense or to threaten other political units. People mean power, and power can be projected by way of bodies. So for this reason, population increases or decreases have always been defined or identified as vital to security and war. though it's fair to say that the importance of raw population as an increment of state power or even group power has waxed and waned across time in response to technological innovations and broad normative social changes depending upon who has political access. Contemporary interest in population as a source of military power has its origins in the French Revolution with the rise of the mass army, when large-scale populations were now brought into the military instead of a select few. And beyond the normative implications regarding the proper basis of legitimate government, meaning that people have a right that the state represent their interests, and then the state is going to call upon that citizenry to protect that. The French Revolution established demographics, including its emphasis on comparative birth rates, and it's interesting to go back in the historical record and read the Germans and the French really debating who's got the higher birth rates, as an enduring interest of states, whether motivated by greed, so they want to get more land, more resources, more property, insecurity, so they're just fearful that another state, if it grows at a faster rate by population, that it's going to become more insecure, or just straight out aggression. The basic fact is the ability to mobilize large populations in a war effort was thought to be, and I think continues to be, a significant determining factor in a war's outcome. So people believe bigger populations mean a greater likelihood of success in war on the battlefield. And when we come to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, however, threatened to override this. Insofar as technology, the railroad, the steamship, made it possible to maintain and field mass armies. So now the Crimean War probably was the first major instance of this. Mass armies could be taken to faraway fields. The same technologies that were also brought on board were automatic weapons and heavy field artillery, made it possible to destroy these same masses of soldiers that were being brought to the front. So we had this sort of balancing act. The First and Second World Wars appeared to confirm the trend of the importance of machine over man, right, with waves of people being killed in the trenches. The technology of the armored vehicle, the strategic bomber, and in particular strategic nuclear weapons, which was all about putting populations in harm's way. You take out you threaten to take out a state's population with nuclear weapons, and that state will capitulate, making it appear that populations were more vulnerable and at the same time less relevant to fighting power, except as logistical support in the form of factory workers or farmers. Yet in the years since the end of World War II, the importance of population as a key component of national security again, I would argue, began to rise after colonial wars, a series of colonial wars and decolonization, in which high-tech, capital-intensive, highly industrialized, modernized, intensive militaries lost bitter contests to the relatively backward, labor-intensive militaries in Asia and Africa. And we can just think about the United States and Vietnam, or the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, where you had large masses of populations defeating these very, very modern, highly developed militaries. Moreover, interstate wars between major powers, again with the rise of nuclear weapons, appear to be relegated to a sort of insignificance, with the idea that we're going to have large-scale, great power to great power conflict, battle of arms, seem to go out of fashion. While civil wars, and here Woodrow Wilson, self-determination, right, where you have decolonization and groups vying for political power, emerged as a predominant and primary mode of political violence. In these types of wars, population came to the fore because it became a major determinant of that political unit, that group's fighting capacity, its military capacity. Today, as a feature of the interstate system, interstate wars do on some level seem poised to make a slow comeback. I mean, we have a lot of disruptions in the interstate system, but the combination of cheap transportation technology, high birth rates in the so-called developing world, and pride in national identity have combined to make refugee and immigration flows a significant new factor in security calculations. And we could just think about Europe. And actually today, I was just reading today's New York Times that Sweden and one other country are desperately pleading with the EU to open up its doors to Iraqi refugees. And here it's possible to speak of, we're talking about, people now talk about human security, and what they're talking about, the physical, cultural, and economic security of major states and indeed entire regions. So demography matters, right? And states get very insecure if their numbers start shifting. And this is especially the case, another long-term trend, so we've talked about the character of warfare, is the increasing democratization of states. And the idea, you can include major states such as the Russian Federation and to some extent China, although China is hardly a democracy, and we could argue about Russia as well. But because democracy has at its foundation the principle of majority rule, multinational states, which is to say most states in the world, upwards of 95% of all states in the world, are multinational in some form, comprising one or more ethnic groups. They're adopting democratic forms of governments which will have populations keenly interested in having political power associated with their proportional representation. Right? So even in states, and what I'm finding in my research, and you'll see this in a second, even in states without democratic systems, there is a keen sense that numbers matter. Right? So as anybody is a student of the former Soviet Union, when the censuses started revealing that the Slavic white populations may be a minority, the European Slav, however, the non-Muslim population started getting very nervous. Then they happened to control the Soviet state. And this becomes really apparent if you have a minority group, as in Rwanda or Syria, running the state. But the thing is that now I come to some of the critical parts of this, is that our understanding of these dynamics remains scant. Right? So we have a sense out there that population matters, that when you have shifts in the populations it matters, but we haven't had a sustained empirical and theoretical research on it. And if you look, I am a scholar, so I go through the scholarly journals, and you look to the subjects of them devoted to war and conflict. And in the last 15 years, only a handful of articles, and I'd say only a handful of scholars in the world, have been dedicated to understanding how demographic shifts contribute to large-scale violence both within states and beyond them. Now, there are different ways that to impact demography on war, the impact of demography on war. Of the major studies in existence, two factors have received the most attention: age ratios and sex ratios. And actually, we just got this new handout from the Population Action Council about age structure. We're all very nervous about youth bulges, especially male youth bulges. This group of 16 to 25-year-old males or 15 to 30-year-old males. And the hypothesis there, and this is a very old one, is that the existence of a youth bulge is associated with a higher likelihood of revolt, internal revolt, and war. And there's been some terrific work done by some scholars on this. And then Henrik Erdahl, who was here a couple, earlier in the year, has done some interesting work on this. But even his findings are still in the preliminary stages. And it's mixed record as to whether we should be concerned about these youth bulges. We're still trying to figure out whether it's the actual size of the bulge, proportional to the state, or it's the rate of change and that sort of thing. We still don't have that answer. So whereas age ratios have been examined and speculated upon for decades in one form or another, research on the security implications of sex ratios is relatively new. The sex ratio hypothesis relates the notion of a balance between males and females. And so you want to make sure males have a bride. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to get out their sexual fantasies or whatever. And the greater the imbalance, this is the hypothesis, that these men, you need to give them something to explore and to experience life. So you put them to war, or they go to war, right? So the idea there is the greater the imbalance, the greater there is a surplus of males, the greater the likelihood there is for instability in war. And people are very nervous about China and Asia, India and China, where the sex ratios are really getting skewed, because it's supposed to be something like 102 females to every 100 males, and now we know with infanticide and also now with ultrasound really making its technological advance into Asia, sex selection before birth. Again, although these hypotheses have been examined, the underlying logic empirical support remains speculative. Despite dire warnings about seething populations of too many young males or now equal females, neither factor has yet been shown to be either necessary, so an absolutely necessary condition, because we get cases in which we have war or civil war and no sex ratio differential, or it's not a sufficient condition for violence. Differential population growth rate, it's nice that you have Christian and I were some of the few who are doing this, among identity groups has been less systematically studied even than those two hypotheses. And this is surprising given that the historical wisdom holds that identity group balances are the key of multi-ethnic states, right? You've got to have a demographic balance that's reflected in the political system in order for that state to hold together. And the case that we all think about when we study this is Lebanon. All right. The Civil War in Lebanon in 1958, for example, has largely, and I believe accurately, I've done research on this, been attributed to a shift in the delicate ethnic balance in that state. And I can tell you the Christians and the Muslims, the Maronite, are still fighting over whether those numbers were accurate. But the perception is that they were inaccurate by at least one of the parties, and it was largely the Muslims, and that they felt it didn't reflect the population distribution, and then, of course, political power, which was premised on population sizes. You could also make the case that population pressure of this sort has been used to explain Israel's pullout of Gaza and parts of the West Bank. And demographic balances are a key to stabilizing Iraq. Today, front page New York Times, the Iraqi, the Kurds are holding up certain agreements, the Sunnis are holding up certain agreements, and then, of course, the Shiites are as well. And in part, it's because they feel like they have a right to more or less of the goodies that the Iraqi state promises them down the road. And then in my own earlier work, I wrote a book on the geography of ethnic violence, and particularly on settlement patterns and territoriality. It revealed a strong correlation between groups that were concentrated in a self-declared ethnic homeland and the likelihood that an ethnic conflict within a multinational state would escalate to violence. And this was as much a factor of legitimacy as power. So perceptions really matter in these cases, which again for a researcher is a problem because are we getting the perceptions right? And then of course there are competing perceptions. And also in the case of these, majority rule really mattered. Once an ethnic group reached a majority, they felt empowered, emboldened, legitimate, that they had a claim to greater representation within the state. So what I ended up finding is that concentrated majorities within homelands was practically it was a necessary condition for violence among ethnic groups. Surprisingly, urbanization among ethnic minorities was a sufficient condition for quiescence. Which is really interesting. It seemed as if these groups didn't feel the need, that they were largely material economically based, and they didn't feel the need to rise up against the state. So in sum, given that demographic balances and shifts are vital to the stability of multinational states, and the vast majority of states on the globe are multi-ethnic, it's surprising that scant attention has been paid to the issue. First of all, one of the questions is what causes shifts. This is a question that that actually there's pretty good data on. Richard, I think you look at some of this. What actually causes them, and a couple of things is the relative proportions in states might shift because of differential birth and fertility rates, and that's largely what I look at because that's mainly what happens in most of the states. But economic immigration or political immigration and migration are other explanations for that. Other reasons include deliberate state manipulation, so states will actually pick up populations and move them. And you see this happening, you can, in the former Soviet Union, it happened actually with the ethnic Russians and Russian speakers being moved into Central Asia. And Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, also did this to kind of protect peripheral areas. So empires were very good at manipulating their populations. Man-made disasters such as warfare, or natural disasters such as famines and drought, they also cause population shifts. And mass migration and resettlement, both forced, ethnic cleansing, and spontaneous, so where groups just realize that they're not going to be able to make a living where they're living, may also cause a shift in the size of population. As I said, there's different ways to look at the populations. You can look at the sex ratios, the age ratios, and then identity group, which is what I look at. And if you think of the United States, which, by the way, has some of the best data, the 2000 census revealed that Latinos are growing at a far faster pace than other ethnic groups. And in fact, demographers, I'm not a demographer, I have high regard for them, they're difficult work, but what they do is they don't do predictions. I try to do predictions and probabilities. They're doing projections, and my understanding is that census out projected even the high-end projections, so they tend to do low, medium, and high. And the reason is twofold. The reasons that I've read, I might be corrected here, is Latinos tend to have larger families, they have higher fertility rates, and many immigrants, largely economic to the United States, come from Latin America, made up of Hispanic populations. So according to the U.S. Census projections, and if the current trends continue, again, these are projections, Hispanics, which in 2000 constituted 13% of the American population, will be 25% by 2050. Now, the shift from a predominantly white Protestant culture to Hispanic one is a central subject of Sam Huntington's most recent book, and he points out that such a shift could potentially lead to serious discord within the American polity. Now, I'm not sure I agree with him. I actually think assimilation happens at a far faster rate than he says. But he does raise the very important question or point that we are going to, as Americans, I'm assuming most of us are Americans in the room, we're going to be groping with the idea of what it means to be American, because the culture, the identity of the country will be shifting in a more Hispanic way. If you go to the American West, and I've done a lot of work in New Mexico actually among different Hispanic groups and then American Indian groups, this is a big question. Who has control of political power, local politics, and that sort of thing. And they do divide themselves out according to different racial and actually colonial categories. When did you, or immigrant status, when did you arrive into New Mexico? So I know from my own research that the United States, however, and this is where I'm coming to my own, is exceptional in terms of shifting proportions of identity group population. It turns out that very few populations actually change in proportional size. So if you're looking within a state, you want to know, are whites growing at a faster rate or a slower rate than Hispanics or African Americans? And it turns out that actually most populations are static. So Tanya Ellingson, a woman in Norway, put together the most complete data set on identity group sizes. And few of the groups actually had a significant change over time. In reality, most of the population proportions remain relatively static, and what this means is that our theories of identity politics, if they hold true, it's going to be very difficult to do sort of large-end statistical analysis because we actually don't have a lot of cases for analysis. So before I get more in depth onto my own stuff, let me address why I think there's been so little research, because it's related to these data issues. So I think there's two reasons. First, I think the popular view among citizens of advanced industrial countries, the OECD and the United States and Japan, remains that technology trumps people. I think there is still a sense that numbers still don't matter, right? The United States, we can put 150,000 troops in, and that's going to be enough. And this prejudice, in most cases, I think is unfounded, in some cases positively dangerous, and undermines a general lack of attention to everything from demographics war to strategy and tactics of labor-intensive military organizations. And I did this edited volume on military planning, and time and again there was this sense of hubris that technology could overcome all. When oftentimes, the Soviet Union had this strategy of defense in depth, just pull back and wait, and you've got a huge population that you can bring in later. And it worked in World War II. The Germans, one of the most successful militaries, were defeated in large number because the Soviets pulled back as a result of strategy, and then had huge amounts of population that they could then pull forward. So faith in technology extends across a wide array of social, economic, and political problems. So there's this sort of philosophical or epistemological bias against this idea that demography alone is going to matter. And second, to put it bluntly, the study of demography and civil war, or war in general, is just very tough. The main difficulties being the availability of data, the reliability of data, and separating out demographic determinants of conflict and war from more traditional factors. And so data availability is a problem for two reasons. First, in order to secure reliable demographic data for a country, that country must conduct and publish regular censuses. Well, if you have a country that's poor, or a country that's at war, or a country that's potentially at war, do you think they're going to collect census data, especially if that war is premised on identity politics? Chances are no. And so it's difficult to get the data. And also, if they're poor, it's very expensive to conduct censuses. The United States, we're having debates even today about what it's going to cost to do the next census, right? And we were one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And second, the process of counting a state's population requires a relatively stable environment. Again, you don't want a state that's not stable. So countries undergoing civil strife are precisely those for which we need data, but also those in which census taking is hampered by conflict and violence. We still don't know precisely. One of the issues in Iraq is the Sunnis actually think they're bigger than they are, right? But they might be. We honestly don't know. When somebody told me that fact that the Sunnis may not even be 18% to 20%, they may actually be bigger, or they may be. The truth is, we're not absolutely sure, are we? And so here we are setting up a proportional representation system of government, and we're not even sure of the numbers. And again, it's part of it because the environment is so hostile to collect those data. An additional problem is data reliability, and this is that the population figures are just basically prey to political machinations. And although censuses are vital to policymakers in determining how goods and services should be allocated equitably among a country's population, for tax purposes, educational purposes, provision of medical services, and also for military service. They can also be used for the basis of restricting opportunities, providing rents, bribes, however you want to define it, to members of some identity groups as to others. And so data on identity groups can be manipulated in a variety of ways. And in my case studies, you see size of identity groups being increased or decreased. So in Lebanon, when they did their census under the Maronites, they have not had an official census since 1932. We don't know the size of the populations in Lebanon. And the Maronite Christians controlled the government. They did a census. I think it was 56 was when it was released. And the common sense is they inflated the Maronite Christian numbers, and the Muslims were not happy about it. Groups themselves might be excluded altogether or added to the figures of other groups, and this is a way of diminishing or increasing the political power of a group. So if you add other groups to it, you enhance them. If you take away a group altogether, which the Soviets did, they actually got rid of some groups because they had this whole process of merging together of nations. And if all of a sudden after your forced census you have fewer nations, you have success. It's on paper we have fewer groups. So states have and people who control the government. Or entire censuses could be withheld from publication and public debate. And this is what happened. Actually, the Lebanese one, the Muslims pulled it out of the public file. And then the Soviet Union, the very famous one, is in the 30s after the famines and collectivization and state policies. Ukraine was decimated. I mean, literally decimated. Millions died. And this was revealed in the census, and Stalin shut down the census because, of course, it revealed that the Great Soviet Experiment was failing. So Lebanon, again, they have not had a census since 1932, and the estimated census was, again, seen as largely rigged. Now, one way to get around some of these data issues is there are a lot of aid groups and NGOs out there who actually have to distribute aid and food and that sort of thing. And this actually helped the Muslims because it turned out that the Egyptians had some sort of household survey that they had done in Lebanon to provide aid, and it actually bolstered the case for the Muslims. That actually their numbers were underinflated. There are other examples of how knowledge of shifts in demographics can lead to instability, perhaps war. And then the most prominent contemporary, of course, is Israel, which has to deal with demographic or has been dealing with demographic shifts among its Palestinian and Arab populations, as well as population differentials among Jews themselves. So the ultra-Orthodox tend to have quite a few children, the women upwards of 8 to 1, whereas secular Jewish women tend to have about 2.8. And this is going to lead to some serious political parliamentary debates in Israel because it turns out that the religious Jews don't serve in the military, and they are a pretty big social service taker from the political system. And so Israel, and from a data point, we have very good data, but from a political point, it's going to be some tough road ahead for the Israeli government. And you could make the case, the Sharon policy of the wall, the barrier, the fence, however you want to put it, pulled out of Gaza largely because demographics. If you look at the parliamentary debates under Meridor and others, there was deep concern that a greater Israel was going to lead to a minority Israeli Jewish population. So the key question that we have, going forward is whether Israel's political system will be resilient enough to handle future democratic challenges. I think it will be. It's already made some changes to its political system. Political parties have higher thresholds. It's a way of dampening the influence of minorities. But these are some of the issues they're going to have to deal with, just as the United States may have to deal with them. The Israeli example raises another problem associated with the study of demography and conflict, and that's the role of alternative factors in explaining conflict and war. And these include economic, political, historical, and social. So the rise in conflict in Israel only matters because Israel is a democratic country, and one that affords a generous social security system, both of which are under pressure as population grows and proportions among different populations shift. Right? If that were not the case, then it wouldn't matter how the differential growth rates went. But this raises the point for a scholar or researcher that progress on the independent causal impact of demography and war demands careful research designs and may not be susceptible to the kind of parsimony currently so popular among social scientists in general and political scientists in particular. So turning to my research on ethnic demographic shifts, it's revealed some very interesting dynamics. And in this work, what I've tried to do is answer the question of whether shifts in the distribution of ethnic group populations within a multinational state, I'm not looking across states, make civil war more likely. And as I mentioned earlier, it turns out that most populations within multinational states, and here we're looking at identity groups within states, are static. And you can see this quite clearly here. So, I have to speak into the mic. So we have a total of 588 cases. 471 are static, meaning that the ethnic majority group and the second largest ethnic minority group are the same. That they're growing at the same rate in that state, right? And then the others, you can see that they make up the rest. Now, I ended up creating 9 ideal types here because there are competing hypotheses as to who's going to attack whom, or who's going to get more nervous, who's going to get more greedy, however we want to put it. So is it the majority group that's going to go after a minority group that's increasing in size? Is it going to go after a majority group, going to go after a minority group that's decreasing in size? You get them while they're down. So there's all sorts of competing dynamics and hypotheses that people have put forward. So a way to get at this, I look at which ones, and it turns out, just to give you a sense, people think the most worrisome demographic transitions tend to be where the majority. This turns out to be empirically the fact that the most worrisome are where the majority is increasing and the minority group is decreasing. So this seems to be a very nasty dynamic, because what this means is that the majority group is actually growing in power and strength, population strength, and it's going after a weakening minority group. And so statistically speaking, these are what the data show. And when I say worrisome, I'm looking at civil wars. I'm looking at cases in which there are civil wars. And then the second most worrisome is where the majority group is decreasing, so this is a fearful group, and the minority group is static. And I think the explanation for that is they want to, go after the minority group while they're potentially their strongest. So I'm only looking at civil wars from 1945 to 2000. Just to give you a sense of what a definition of civil war is, the war has to be control over which group is going to control the government. There has to be at least 2 groups of organized combatants. The state was one of those combatants. There had to be at least 1,000 battle deaths per year on average for the entire war. So if it was a 20-year war, it had to be 20,000 battle deaths. The weak had to be able to inflict pain on the strong, so 5% to 95% ratio, meaning the strong side had to at least have 5% of the casualties. And then it had to happen within the boundaries of a state before the war started, because a lot of people think about Yugoslavia. It ended up becoming interstate war because of Croatian independence. And so what I did was I took these transitions, right, mapped them onto whether there was a case of civil war. And again, I found these to be the most problematic. I also controlled for a variety of things. So the bottom line is that their demographic transitions do seem to matter, right? But the first fact I want to point out is that demographic transitions do seem to be rare. Most groups within states seem to be static, which makes sense, because if a state, most states probably, and this is an empirical question, do not distribute goods necessarily differentially among its populations. So groups are going to have the same access to food and medical care and that sort of thing, and that's probably picking up on that, right? That everybody has the same access to a secure life, right? And so that's why they're growing at the same rate. One group is not getting better medical care or something like that. But then within the groups, those are the 2 most problematic.
Are those proportions or those absolute numbers? Because it makes.
What do you mean proportions?
In other words, is it decreasing proportionally, or is it?
Well, I'm going to get to that. So I look at the rate of. So this is just whether the majority group is increasing, relative in proportion. So what is the ratio? Are they 60% to 40%, and then does that shift to 63% to 37%? And so one of the questions is does the rate of change matter, right? And so that's one of the things I actually control for. And it turns out the rate of change does matter, right?
What is your cutoff between static and increase or decrease?
Static is when they stay the same. It's a 60-40 ratio, right?
60-40.
So, well, no. It could be anything. It could be 20-80. It doesn't change. Both population the populations remain the same. The proportions between them right?
If it just changes 1%?
That would be an increase. So if the majority group goes to 81%, that would be a majority group increase. So in the more sophisticated statistical analysis, you can't really see this. It's in the paper. I test for rate of change, and it does matter. So what I talk about is the ratios, right? So as the minority group is achieving parity with the majority group, you do have a greater probability of war. And that's being captured right here, this ratio. Right. But you can see the coefficient isn't big, right? It's not huge. It's not a huge impact, but there is a relationship there. The other important one that's there is that it matters more who's increasing. If the minority is increasing more, you have a greater probability than if the majority is increasing more. Although both of them indicate a greater probability, it's just that minority group increase is more. And this is important because if you're looking at states and you're looking at the differential demographics, it should send up alarm bells if the minority group is growing at a disproportion because, again, it makes sense. They're going to put pressure on that political system. If they're not satisfied, you may have this indicates you're going to have a greater likelihood of violence. Yes?
Just one clarification on this. The minority group is static, but the majority group is decreasing. There's other populations in there.
Yes. There are. But just so you know, this is using Tanya Ellingson's ethnic brood data. This is only cases in which this is the ethnic majority, so this is the largest group in a state, and the second largest group in the state. So we really have a limited number of cases. Lebanon, for instance, is not represented here. These are ethnic data. She doesn't have good religious data. So if anybody controls funding through NSF, I really am making a plea. We need better data, right? Because Lebanon should be represented on this chart, but it's not because we just don't have the data. In part because we don't have good censuses, But the point is that this is looking at just the largest majority group, and then the second largest minority. So if you think about Russia and Chechnya, what's the second largest minority in Russia? It's not Chechens, it's Tatars. So Chechnya is not represented here either. But even given those sort of data, and I was pretty careful in making sure I matched everything up, this is what the results are showing to be the most worrisome patterns. Is that those transition types 2, those transition type 6, and then when the minority is increasing at a greater rate than the majority, that's a more worrisome pattern. So that's where the research to date stands. I'm working on expanding the data set to include linguistic groups. This is just ethnic groups. It's not linguistic groups. And it's not religious groups, because I think religious groups really matter. All right, so just let me conclude. Does anybody else have any other questions about? Yeah.
I'm just curious on how, given the difficulty in actually getting a good count of people, how can, in countries where you think there's going to be conflict, and there is conflict based on these shifts, how could a 1% change from static to non-static? How could that be meaningful if you're not getting accurate data? Yeah,
that's a great question. And what you would hope is that if there's a bias, right, that the bias is systematic and that it doesn't go against you. I mean, we're doing the best we can with these sorts of data. But the thing is that usually when there's a shift, for it to be picked up by the census takers, it tends to be more than 1%. It's going to be 4%, 3%. It's not going to be these minuscule sorts of met. And you would hope that the bias, I didn't collect the data, so I'm not imputing a bias. Tanya got it from a variety of sources, including the CIA World Factbook and that sort of thing, that it doesn't bias the analysis in the end. But it's a good question, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to look at rate of change, because does it matter? But at this point, I'm not comfortable with saying that I don't have refined enough data to say when you go from a 2 percentage point to a 5% shift that you have a 50% greater likelihood of war. I don't think we're at that point yet. So that's why I beg for,
Look at all whether minority or the majority were in power, have the political power.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't control for that. It would be relatively straightforward to be able to do that. Because you can think of Rwanda, you can think of Syria. There are cases in which that does occur.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out how it would happen the minority would be decreasing in size unless it were either the the group that was in power,
Yeah.
and so had more resources and
Yeah.
were further along the demographic transition,
Yeah.
or if they were out migrating for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Gibb's getting nervous because we're
Sorry.
we're,
No,
we're
I was
going
just gonna
off
say,
mic.
if we can, maybe we can come back to that as the first question when we
Yeah, it's a good question.
wrap up the
All right, so
presentation.
just let me conclude because I'm sure I've gone over. I got into this because it's an incredibly important topic, and I teach at a school of public policy, and it's a tremendously important public policy problem, an issue. In the United States, we're dealing with it, but across the globe, they're dealing with it. And shifts in facilitating technologies, along with, in some cases, deliberate demographic strategies for attaining power and resources, continue to be under-researched, yet they are political issues that are happening across the globe, and they're poorly understood. And I think in some instances, I know that you're with USAID, it influences whether and how we should give out aid and where we should be targeting our intervention strategies. So, what I would say is I'm delighted that the audience is so large, and I welcome your questions. And then also if you have areas in which you think further research or ways to improve the research, one of the things I'm doing is I am looking at ethnic demographic shifts alone. So I'm trying to get at these transition types. But now I'm combining it with the youth bulge because it doesn't matter whether a particular ethnic group has a bulge in its male population, and we're now starting to see, even though the data are still not so great, I'm not going to say they're terrible, they're still not so great, I think we're now at a point where we can start integrating and doing some cross-analysis across different kinds of variables on these demographic transitions. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica.
You have a nicer watch.
So I always struggle with whether I should tell this joke or not because Monica and Rich have both heard this joke before, but we are talking about a very serious subject matter, and so I think it's important to kind of loosen up a little bit about it. So I apologize if you've heard it before because there aren't a lot of jokes about ethnic conflict. So there's all the EU delegates on a plane with Russian and American representation. And they're flying to this important meeting, and as invariably happens on these planes, and as happened sort of on my plane yesterday when I came here, something fails on the plane, but we didn't have to get off. We just went back. Whereas these guys, the pilot comes back and says, we're still going to make it, but 3 people are going to have to get off. And so long faces all around, and the Russian delegate stands up and says, well, we are not part of European Union, and So I guess I will jump out of the plane, and he goes off, to the door, and long live free Russia, and he jumps out, and off he goes. And the American guy says, well, I guess I should really join my Russian colleagues since we're not part of the European Union either, and walks up to the door, and long live free America, and he jumps out. And the Irish delegate gets up and walks to the door and says, long live free Ireland, and throws the British delegate off the plane. On that note, I like working on this topic partially because, and I'm surprised that not more people work on it because it's sort of the basic script to any B movie, right? Demography and security, demography and violence. So it's always sex and violence, right? So I think intrinsically it should be more attractive than it is. And I can also say from experience that I practice what I preach. I'm married with 3 kids, so I do the demography part. And yes, I am married, so I also do the conflict part. So, it's been an interesting week. If you followed the news this week, SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute, released its yearbook, and the yearbook showed 17 significant conflicts last year, all of them domestic. And you've also probably heard the news and heard lots of talk about Kosovo in the news. Anybody remember what happened yesterday, 8 years ago? Any of you might have even been involved in the event. It's when NATO started bombing the Serbs in Kosovo. And today we're talking about independence. Why should it matter that we're talking about Kosovo? Because Kosovo Albanians have the youngest population structure of any population in Europe. 70% of Kosovar Albanians are under the age of 30. If you think that's a high proportion, you can go to my own country where I now live, Canada. And we have significant challenges with our Aboriginal population in terms of roadblocks, in terms of taking over land that the Aboriginal population claims as its own. And the Aboriginal population in Canada, 80% of the Aboriginal population is under the age of 30. And if you look around the world, Indigenous populations in particular tend to have a particularly young age structure. And it should come thus as no surprise that the Indigenous agenda and First Nations agenda is a prime agenda across the world, and in particular in South America. And a number of South American countries are rethinking their stance towards the Aboriginal populations. We've had a project for the last 4 years, for instance, with the Bolivian armed forces on how they can better integrate their Aboriginal population into their armed forces. This comes after an incident where during a demonstration 400 Indigenous protesters were shot by the military, and the Chief of Staff realized that something had to be done, that this is probably not the way we can run the country and live together. So all you need to do is basically open a newspaper any day of the week, and you'll find a story that has demographic links to it. I teach at the only military university in Canada, which is also the only nationally funded university. And so my interests aren't just purely academic. They're directly related to teaching the future officers of the Canadian forces. You'll see a graphic in your handout that'll also show you afterwards where they are deployed. So this is sort of the maybe one place in the country where when you teach political science, everybody's going to take away what you teach them, and they know that in part their lives depend on them, on what you teach them. So my concerns here are also not just purely theoretical; they're also very pragmatic in terms of implications. And you see here on the outline what I've planned today: talk a little bit about how the nature of conflict has changed, the research problems that throws up that I want to discuss today. The demographic method and why it's an interesting method to use. Some of the case studies, Monica and I take a different point of departure. I come at this more as a comparativist, and so as that, I look for puzzles. So outcomes, so places where you have very differing outcomes. And so I want to discuss 3 case studies that I think can tell us something very interesting about differing outcomes and how demography can help us explain some of these, and then talk a little bit about implications for research and for public policy. My own particular focus is, as with Monica, in the area of political demography. If you're wondering what in the world political demography is, I threw up a little definition for you here, but basically it's dealing with the political implications of demographic shifts. In this particular area, I have 3 sort of research tracks. One is looking at ethnic conflict. One is looking at federalism and multi-level governance. And to that end, I'll pass around the latest book, which is just kind of hot off the press, and you can just kind of pass that around and look through it. The concern here is that all Western countries are increasingly differentiating in terms of population structure on the territories, on their own territories. So, for instance, in the United States, you have immigrants primarily settling in 6 states: California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey, New York, and Illinois. And so this is leading to a dramatic differentiation, demographic differentiation of the country. And this, in turn, has policy implications and attitudinal implications, and those express themselves in opinion surveys, in electoral preferences, and so I think looking at demographics doesn't just tell us a lot about what might be happening overseas. It can also tell us a lot about what's happening in our own country and where our own countries are going. And my third research track, and I'll explain sort of towards the end of the presentation why I think that one is particularly important, focuses on the security sector, more generally in the armed forces in particular, in operationalizing diversity in the security sector. and we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that in a moment. Just to give you a quick idea of why this is a relevant topic, you see that my particular research focuses not as much necessarily on wars per se, but on security. So that is to say, how people themselves perceive their lives to be transpiring and whether they feel secure, as Monica pointed out, in their physical environment, in their economic environment, and especially in their cultural environment. We'll get back to this in a moment. You see here some of the trends in conflict. These data are from what used to be called the State Failure Project. That project seems to change its name every 3 or 4 years. It's kind of like Prince. The artist used to be known as Prince. What you see, and you have these graphs in your handout here, is actually a decline in conflict. So it's important to realize that this anecdotal perception that sort of conflict has been spiraling out of control since the end of the Cold War is actually empirically unfounded. And if you look at the trends, overall significant conflict, especially internationally, but just as much domestically, has been on the wane. What is particularly important, however, is that there's one type of conflict that has been proven to be sort of the most, that has emerged as the most significant type, and that tends to be conflict related to ethnicity. And you see from the graphs that these conflicts tend to be the most prevalent in states that have the least amount of capacity. So that is to say, particularly your state capacity and economic capacity and the capacity of your state to provide services to its population seems to have an interesting correlation with the incidence rates of conflict, of domestic conflict in particular states. This is a particular important graph and something that I think has not been paid sufficient attention to. Demographers look at 3 basic variables: fertility and mortality, which make up this phenomenon called natural increase, but there's also this wild card called migration. And immigration or emigration not only dramatically affects the actual population, but it also affects the possibility of that population to regenerate itself, because if you have people, and women of course of childbearing age, emigrating, then that reduces your capacity for future population growth. If you have immigrants and female immigrants of childbearing age, then that obviously exacerbates the capacity of your particular population group for population growth. And one of the big untalked about phenomena internationally is the massive internal shifts of populations and the shifts of populations across borders as a result of conflict, which then often triggers more conflict in the neighborhood. And so the phenomenon of migration is a really important wild card when we're talking about demographic shifts. And so in addition to how populations shift relative to one another, obviously if you have a sudden population influx, then that can dramatically distort the models or the projections that you might have for the populations and whether they're growing or not. In 2 populations that might have looked perfectly static beforehand, all of a sudden you get a sudden shift or influx across the border, as for instance happened in Macedonia in the 1990s, and that can destabilize the entire situation. So that's just as a remark, not to forget about the importance of migration. This is what the operations looked like, the UN major UN operations from 1945 to 1990. I think a sort of a total of 13 major operations, so relatively low key. The number of Security Council resolutions made it up to number 600 by the end of the Cold War. And this is what the operations have looked like since 1990. We made it from resolution to 600 to resolution 1600 in 10 years. This a little over 10 years. So it tells you something about the fact that there's something changing. And so this poses, I think, 2 significant questions. One thing we want to know is we want to know about the nature of conflict. Under what circumstances do we get conflict, especially do we get a shift from conflict to violence? David Layton makes a very important point that a lot of researchers lump conflict and violence in together. But I actually think that they are very distinct phenomena and distinct shifts in phase. And what I consider violence is not as much a scientific sort of definition of battle deaths, but a perception of, is the other side doing large-scale significant violence to my group? This is the Ian Lustig definition of violence. And I think this expands the category of possible scenarios and cases with which to deal. The other major research question is, under what circumstances do you tend to get increased violence or decreased violence? So what are the factors that might be mitigating or exacerbating a violence that's already happening on the ground? And again, the question here is, can demography and demographic shifts and change tell us something about that? We also know where the major problems are likely to occur. There are, depending on how you count, between 3,000 and 5,000 ethnic groups in the world, and the largest proportion of those, about 2,200, sort of on the categories that I use, live in Asia, and about another 1,800 in Africa. And so it should come as no surprise that those are also the continents where we should likely expect to have the biggest engagement in the coming years in terms of trying to wrestle with ethnic conflict. These are, of course, also the continents that have, by and large, are only embarking on the demographic transition, or have not yet passed through the demographic transition, or where you have state capacity issues such as failed states in place, where people continue to have very large family sizes, simply as a matter of being able to sustain themselves as they grow older.
What year is this?
This is from last year or 2 years ago, from the foreign policy website. To give you an idea of how the conflict itself has also changed, a picture of my colleague Bernd Horn. The picture above is Bernd in Cyprus. And if you're wondering whether places like Afghanistan are going to take a long time, Cyprus was a pretty easy mission, and after 40 years, we're still there. So if you're wondering how long we're going to be in Afghanistan and Iraq, Cyprus might be a good indication. Below is Bernd in Bosnia, 10 years later. And you can see up Cyprus shorts and, short-sleeved, and this isn't looking too dangerous a situation. You can see below here Bernd behind the machine gun on the armored personnel carrier. Clearly, these are different types of conflict, and so something must be going on in terms of the form of conflict. Here's another picture from Cyprus. I mean, the most serious incidents that you'd get is here's a few youths throwing stones at each other, right? And so you can see them. They're not even wearing helmets. They have their rifles sort of swung over the back. So clearly that this was not going to be too difficult a situation to defuse. You can see this is a jeep that's not even armored. So you can see this is obviously not too serious a situation. And here's what we're dealing with today, and what armed forces like to talk about as their 3-block war, where within one block you have to you might actively have to engage insurgents. You might be trying to provide stability for a governance policy program, whatever it might be, and a humanitarian operation distributing food and whatever else it might be. So clearly the type of conflict seems to be changing. I think this is heavily related to what I shall call sort of ontological conflict and ontological security. That it's not as much that people are necessarily just feel threatened in terms of their physical or their economic security, but that people, for whatever reason, seem to have, and we can go through these explanations during the question period, since the 1990s, there has been a greater effort at calling into question what Charles Taylor would call a person's horizon of meaning, and where another group actively tries to sabotage or eliminate what gives meaning to your particular group and your life as you want to live it and flourish within that group. And this is partially, I think, what drives the sense of violence between groups, because if you feel that your entire, not just your physical security, but everything that gives meaning to your life and your cultural existence is threatened, I have a sense that you're more likely to take up arms against the aggressor. And so this is what I call the problem of the securitarization of minorities. And we see this around the world, where minorities become a security problem. And a lot of my research on the policy side focuses around how can we turn the problem into part of the solution. And this is why I think the security sector is so important. There's also this phenomenon of the perversion of violence that we've driven minorities to. That is to say, minorities that take up arms seem to get a hearing among the world community. The moment you can demonstrate that you're a minority that is a genuine threat to domestic and international peace and stability, the UN Security Council will listen to you. If you're just a quiet minority that tries to lobby on the political side, you don't seem to get a lot done. And so what happens is you get a situation like Kosovo where clearly there's a lot of bad things that happen in Kosovo. Partially what happened is that the Kosovo Liberation Army mounted a major offensive to which then the Serbs responded. Of course, there had been lots of oppression and whatever else beforehand. But basically what we're doing is in some ways, by granting Kosovo independence, we're rewarding people who took up arms to get their grievances resolved. Given that we have 5,000 ethnic groups in the world, I'm not particularly sure I want to live in the world with 5,000 independent states where every ethnic group gets their own little state. And so this is why I think this research is important, because we need to learn how we can govern countries and have people live together. I think this is an important important implication of what we're trying to do here. A couple of methodological comments here. Demography is interesting, as Monica pointed out, because you can model it and project it. Unlike economic or social or political circumstances, you can project with a reasonable degree of accuracy into the future what demographic circumstances are going to look like 20, 30 years from now. And so it can help us if we have better direction on what sort of circumstances seem to be correlating strongly with problems. We can invest ourselves early in those sort of circumstances, and we know that it's a lot easier and cheaper to try to work with people on preventive diplomacy and aid than to send in entire military battalions, and then try to reconstruct a society. Other important implications of work on demography is political science is often accused of not being able to predict anything. All they can do is explain things that have happened in the past. And so I think demography allows us to get out of this ex post facto conundrum that political science often is alleged to face. Demography should never be seen as deterministic on its own. Obviously, it complements social, psychological, historical, economic, political factors. But as we shall see in one of the case studies, that oftentimes political scientists invariably put a lot of emphasis on institutional arrangements. And I think one of the things that demographic research can show us is that maybe the institutional arrangements aren't actually that important, and that there's a number of other factors at play here on which we need to focus, rather than just fixing electoral systems and fixing representations in national assemblies, and that somehow apparently will make the conflict go away. There are important implications, limitations to the demographic method. One is, of course, that you essentialize categories. That is to say, you group people together as these folks are all Croats and these folks are all Serbs, which we know doesn't work particularly well, neither in Serbia nor in Croatia, where half the population is actually intermarried. But what matters is not as much, I think, the comeback to that essentialist criticism is that most people think about their identity in essentialist terms. Most people think of themselves as a native person, or as an American, or as a Hispanic person. And so I think this is something where, as academics, we often kind of like to think that all identities are constructed and look at how smart we are because we can show that all the identities are constructed. But really, people think of themselves in essentialist terms. And so I think it's perfectly fine to essentialize people in demographic categories, as long as we realize that there's certain limitations to that method. But I think it's not entirely prohibitive, and it's certainly not doesn't mean we have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Monica has already commented on the issues of reliability. One additional remark there: the way censuses are collected differs dramatically from country to country, and so you can't just throw together a whole bunch of demographic data and sort of run a large-scale regression on it, because you would actually need to code for differences in the way censuses and data are collected. And so this increases the problem of doing large N research, which I think is still very important. But there's another caveat there, and this is why I personally always prefer to work more on the comparative side, because it's easier to correct and to ascertain the errors in collection or different methods in collection. The other problem with demography is that it usually only allows for weak arguments, for correlations with other situations. But I think as political scientists, and what political science can bring to the study is questions of causation, strong arguments. What needs to happen in what order? Questions of path dependency and questions of context. What else needs to happen at the same time? So demography can't just be taken in isolation. 3 case studies here. These case studies are picked not just because they pose interesting puzzles, but because, as David Layton says, one of the errors we make is we always sample on the dependent variable. We look only at conflict. And so we try to explain the presence of conflict. But of course, if you want to explain the presence of conflict, we also want to know something about the absence of conflict. And this is why I personally think small island states are particularly interesting. Well, partially they're interesting because it's very easy to do your literature review on them, because there's not a lot of people who are writing about small island states. But they're also interesting because they're in the social sciences the closest that we have to laboratory experiments and closed systems, where we have we can control, I think, at least more in a more concerted manner and a more systematic manner for the variables at play. I think it's very difficult in a situation like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to control for all the variables at play, because the conflict is so complex. And so, at a minimum, conflicts in these small island states are perhaps not quite as complex as they are in some of the conflicts that are sort of widely studied, such as Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine. So I think there's something to be gained from the study of small island states. Mauritius and Fiji. Mauritius, some of you might be familiar with, in the Indian Ocean. It's sort of always held up by the IMF as sort of the poster child for Africa as to how you should do things and how Mauritius did everything right. What the IMF doesn't tell you is that when Mauritius became independent in 1968, basically everybody in the world community thought that Mauritius was going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world, 1 million people, 4 major world religions, a significant number of major ethnic groups on the island, and so everybody thought that this wasn't going to work. When Fiji became independent in 1970, similar ethnic arrangements, similar economy. Incidentally, the same person, the Home Office in London, handled the independence of the two and helped write the constitutions for the two countries. So there's a lot of similarities between these two countries. Fiji was going to work out just dandy, and everybody had great hopes for Fiji. And what we find is that the exact opposite happened. That Mauritius has actually turned out to be a reasonably stable society where people have been able to get along despite an institutional arrangement, the best loser electoral system, that is often widely criticized by political scientists as not a particularly viable system for countries with deep ethnic divisions. And so one of the one of the questions is, well, what might explain this difference? And so here we have countries that tend to be very similar, and so we can apply sort of the most similar method approach to them. And one of the kind of things that shows up as being rather different is the demographic developments of those two countries. Now, without going into the details, since I've gone on for a little bit here, we can discuss them during the question period. Basically, if I show you these two graphs, you can see, in comparison, Mauritius and Fiji, you can see very different demographic developments, and you can see actually demographic developments in Fiji that fit very nicely the findings that Monica put forward about power transition theory with regards to explaining civil wars. Basically, what happened is, as soon as the Indian then minority was voted into power and acquired political power, all hell kind of broke loose. They've had three coups in the last 14 years, and one of the things that has triggered is out-migration by people of Indian ancestry. And so you can see that here you have a situation where the majority is now back to being Melanesians, and yet the coups and the difficulties continue, and this seems to fall quite nicely in line with Monica's findings predict. This has to do with fertility structure, and this has to do with outmigration among the Indian population. And there's also a youth component to that, but I'll skip over all of that. And just talk about my next example, which is Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine. One of the things that puzzled me there is there something curious about the fact that at the time when conflict seems to be on the wane, violence seems to be on the wane in Northern Ireland, we have the Intifada and we have conflict increasing in the Israel-Palestine territories. Now, if I make any label mistakes or you disagree with the way I label anything with regards to Israel, Palestine, or whatsoever, please blame it on pure ignorance by a Canadian. I have no normative biases whatsoever towards one side or the other side here, and because I know this is a bit of an explosive topic. So I just want to throw that out as a caveat, and I'm happy to, depending on where I give the presentation, people always suggest I need to rename it this or I need to rename everything that. So just that as a caveat beforehand. But what we find, and each of these are separate papers, and I'm happy to email you a copy of the paper for your feedback and for your examination if you want to look at the details. But basically what we find in Northern Ireland is a deceleration of population growth among Protestants, or I guess among Unionists might be a better way to label them, since most people don't really identify strongly with religious identity in Northern Ireland, despite people talking about Catholics and Protestants. That Unionists went through the demographic transition sort of 2 generations really before Catholics. In addition to that, there had been pretty steady out-migration among, however you might want to call them. Would you want to call them nationalists? Would you want to call them Republicans? So basically the proxy for Catholics. Until really the 1960s. And so that mitigated the much stronger sort of population growth capacity on the Catholic side. So as that out-migration starts to wane, the Catholic population, the Republican nationalist population, grows in relative proportion to the Protestant population and is now projected to become a plurality and a majority and a voting majority by as early as 2026. And so also what the Unionists start to notice is that since the 1970s, every time you sit down to negotiate a deal, the deal actually gets worse for the Unionists. And part of that is because London realizes that the Republican nationalists have more and more political clout. And of course, there are seats to be gained in Northern Ireland for any government in London, and so London isn't about to negate that. And so this is why we see people like Ian Paisley who vowed never to work together or to govern with the Republican nationalist Republican nationalist side, all of a sudden getting together. And I think demographic factors played an important role in motivating people to come to an agreement and to make peace. By the way, Northern Ireland is also a perfect example of how you mishandle civil unrest. I mean, Northern Ireland started as a civil rights movement, and as the state clamped down heavy-handedly on that movement, it took them 35 years to iron out the problems. So it's a good example of how if you get it wrong right at the beginning, you can spend the next 35 years trying to mop up. In the Israeli-Palestinian situation, you have, as Monica already mentioned, sort of opposite dynamics. Now, the dynamics are pretty stable between the Arab population in smaller Israel, so the state territory of Israel, and people who identify with the Jewish heritage on that particular territory. However, the dynamics are perhaps not as stable as people think, because you will find fabulous demographic numbers on everything in Israel, with the exception of out-migration. It's very interesting how the Israeli state counts out-migration. One of the ways you can count out-migration is by looking at how many people come through Ben Gurion Airport, and you can look at things like nursery school enrollments and declining nursery school enrollments in English language nursery schools. And in addition to that, you have about 700,000 people of Israeli citizenship residing in the United States. As long as they go back and visit once every 4 years, they're still counted as a resident. And so the numbers on the Jewish side may not actually be quite as large, may not actually be over 80% as many people claim, but actually may be closer to 70%. But we don't actually have exact figures on that, but it shows you how states sort of manipulate some of their demographic data, even if they look like they have everything demographic under the sun on their populations. At the same time, you see over the last 40, 50 years, dramatic growth in the Palestinian territories, or what's sometimes referred to as Greater Israel, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza has some of the highest population growth rates in the world anywhere. And so this begs an interesting question I'll get back to in a moment. But basically what we see is, at the same time as we have sort of demographics that seem to favor making peace in Northern Ireland, we have shifts in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that really seem to show that time is on the side of the Palestinians. So that this, I think, certainly has something to do with the intensity of the conflict. We can discuss the details later. As I say, I'm happy to email you the paper. The third comment, the third case study, is this notion of, I want to get back to this notion of ontological security. One of the interesting research questions in the Israel-Palestinian conflict is, why are total fertility rates so incredibly high in Gaza and the West Bank? And one of the hypotheses that I throw forward is a notion that I call the demographic security dilemma. What happens is, when a perceived minority group grows and grows substantially, dominant and hegemonic states that have the means to do so tend to clamp down on them. And they tend to clamp down on them in part, not just to control them, but in part to trigger out-migration among those populations. And that's exactly what, for instance, happened in Fiji as the Melanesian population starts to make life very difficult for the Indian population. Now, of course, in the Israel-Palestinian situation, the problem is that really for the last 40 years, there hasn't been a lot of places for Palestinians in the occupied territories to migrate to, and this partially explains the dramatic population growth among that population group. But essentially, the demographic security dilemma refers to this situation where you're aggravating the security situation by clamping down on the other group, which then seems to cause into question sort of their ontological security and their ontological well-being. And part of the reaction to that seems to be relatively high total fertility rates. Not necessarily as a causal reaction, but at least as slowing down the progress and transition through the demographic transition. And so slowing down people's decisions to have fewer children. And so this brings me to this notion that in public policy terms, one of the important implications is that really what we need to be encouraging states to do is the exact opposite of what the intrinsic reaction by state is to these security challenges. If states, I think, if Israel, I mean, this is a hypothetical proposition, thought experiment that is never going to happen, but if Israel were to build an extensive welfare state infrastructure in the occupied territories, chances are the same thing would happen that has happened in just about all other jurisdictions in the world where you've built state capacity, which is that conflict declines and demographic and fertility rates start to decline. So that one of the response is actually a very counterintuitive response to the problem that states are facing, hence this idea of a security dilemma. A couple of other implications. That we need to pay greater attention to security. That people invariably we tend to study a lot on the political side, the governance side, the economic side, and the societal well-being side, but very little attention is being paid to the security sector. And yet, if we want to seem to fix societies that are broken, if we can't provide security and if people don't feel safe, we can't really do much on the development and governance side. And so this is why I think this idea of how do we work with the security sector and making sure that all sides perceive the security sector as providing security for them is a serious problem. I'll stop there. I've made the other remarks. Thanks for your time and attention.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut that a little short. I wanted to save some time for questions and discussion. So, did you still have your question here, Scott? No? If you could wait for the microphone here. Or we can just start up on the side here. We can cut back to Scott here later.
Carol Laval, U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you very much, both of you, for what I think is a fascinating field of research. I actually have a question, I guess, to both of you, or each one of you. Let me just quickly put them out. For Monica, the issue of diasporas, and it comes up a little bit in Christian's presentation also, and how do you count, where do diasporas figure in when you're thinking about demographic shifts? As well as refugee returnees. If you think about the case of Rwanda, for example, the concern is you have successive waves of refugees. You have both out-migration and in-migration that is affecting conflict in very different ways. And the second question to Christian is you discussed the nature of conflict and how this will help us think a little bit more about the nature of violence, nature of conflict. Where do intractable conflicts fit into this? I mean, you do mention Ireland, and that certainly is an intractable conflict. But do demographics do they have a different weight relative to how intractable the conflict actually is, or does that not matter? Is it the same mechanism at play in both cases?
Okay, and actually, if you could just pass the microphone up down the table here a little bit to the gentleman here.
This is a question mainly for Christian, but I think I'm sorry. David Alfer from Winrock International. Part of this leads into Monica as well. I am curious about the numbers that you're using in these graphs for deaths in conflict and levels of conflict, because I've seen these graphs before, and one of the things that strikes me, particularly in the Global Trends in Armed Conflict, 1946 to 2004, this is a measurement of a very narrowly defined armed conflict. So you'll notice, for example, that there's no spike in 1994 when 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda. So one of the things that these graphs seem to suggest to me, and you'll notice you do see a spike in refugees and displaced populations. These numbers seem to suggest to me that it's an increasingly safe time to be a soldier, but if you're a civilian, it's not so hot. And that would seem, I'm curious how this is working into your numbers, because that could be a very large discrepancy between what you're looking at and the results that you're getting. So yeah, let me just leave it there. Where this is tying in, Monica, is there seem to be some mixed metaphors in what can be considered a civil war within the terms that you're using. You're mentioning a couple of things that don't, a couple of instances of conflict that don't fit into your definition. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that.
All right, so I'll start with Corolla and the diasporas and refugees, and I think Christian alluded to it more with his data on transmigration, internally displaced peoples, and that sort of, and just straight refugees. I guess my answer is that these are gross measures, and the refugees are not counted by states. They don't want to count them. They're not citizens. They don't have political rights. I mean, this is the big problem with refugees, and actually now we're seeing with internally displaced, as other states do not allow the refugees to come across borders. So in terms of my research, it doesn't really come into play. I think it's an incredibly important factor, but it doesn't come into play because the data that I'm relying on are largely based on state censuses, and states don't count the refugees as part of their populations because they're not citizens. Despite saying that, the discourse around them, and we just think of Europe today and North Africa and Turkey and the Muslim populations, it matters. And state immigration policy, I've done some research. I have an article, The Myth of the Borderless World. I mean, if we truly had a globalized borderless world, why is refugee policy such high state policy? And we see that in Europe in contemporary debates. And it's because of this immigration issue. So you can get at some of those numbers if some states do track asylum, who's trying to get asylum and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, they're not part of my data because they're not counted in censuses. And David, yours about the civil wars, I tend to have a higher threshold. The armed conflict data that Christian uses is they go down as low as 25 battle deaths per year, and mine is 1,000 battle deaths per year on average. So it's a total. you're right. I'm trying to move along the continuum of just straight conflict. I can't help that, because in order for an ethnic group to be identified in my analysis, they have to be identified, either self-identifying because they need or desire some sort of political representation, or the state has identified them in some discriminatory manner. So for my analysis to begin, it typically assumes, and it's a bias of the analysis, but I hope it's not too egregious of one, there has to be some level of conflict either coming from the group itself or from the state or from the dynamic of the two, which is usually the case, all the way to the large-scale violence. And you're right, I do mix. So I'm looking at both cases where there's large-scale violence and cases where there's not. Belgium happens to be a case that I study with the Walloon and the Flemish populations, and there hasn't been civil war. Quebec, and you actually talk to Anglophones, and they say there's going to be civil war. I'm telling you, just hold on. But the Quebecois, that's another case. So I actually study both cases of non-civil war and civil war. But when I do the large N analysis, I'm looking the bias there. But when I do the qualitative cases, I do look at both.
The diaspora phenomenon has, of course, been driven sort of by two major variables. One is sort of the acceleration and advancement in communication, and the other is the greater ease of transportation. I think the case studies speak to this somewhat. Mauritius is the only country in the world that is, if you want, run or governed by the Indian diaspora. Again, with Israel, you have about a third of the global sort of Jewish diaspora living in Israel, and part of Israel's predicament is that the diaspora doesn't want to immigrate to Israel particularly badly anymore, because life's a lot more comfortable for the diaspora in most of the places where they are, and so there's not a particular sort of enticement to return. I think the key question with regards to diasporas is, on the one hand, how they influence conflict back in their home country, and I have a project on this with Rick McCauley from what used to be the Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict before it was shut, or it will be shut down at the end of this month. But this is, I think, one of the key questions: what are the transnational links of how diasporas fan flames? I have a paper on that I can send you, particularly the way I think diasporas. Why do some diasporas support violence in their home countries, and why do other diasporas work through the institutions of their host countries to change things on the ground in their home countries? And of course, what we want to encourage is diasporas to behave in a way as that they work through their host countries rather than sending money directly to support radicalism in their host country. And so I think there's some interesting dynamics and a very important research project. The question is also, do we as host countries want to securitize these diasporas, which will then only entice them to support violence in their home country, or are we actually going to integrate them into our society and make them real stakeholder into building our society and show them that we want to have them as part of our society? I realize this will be a controversial debate in and of itself. On the refugee returnees sort of question, I have another project on post-conflict reconstruction in Bosnia, where we look at sociocultural factors of post-conflict reconstruction with regards to demographic change. And there's actually some really nice examples. For instance, you can look at a little town called Doboj in the Republika Srpska, which is basically the same ethnic composition that it was before the war. And interestingly enough, it was an American reconstruction project, Doboj, and it's become sort of a key case study on how do you actually handle refugee returnees. And so there are nice examples of that this can actually be done, and it can be done in a way that we don't have to completely disaggregate territorially all the groups, that we can actually bring the groups back home into a town and have them govern themselves, a little town of 60,000 people, and it's working quite well. And as I say, kudos to the Americans, because there's a lot of European countries that screwed up the refugee returnee issue pretty badly in Bosnia. On the nature of conflict, I think the easy answer might be Bill Zartman's notion of herding stalemates. That I think once you get into a herding stalemate, I think that's where situations such as demographic change start to matter, because that's what then seems to, if everything else is a herding stalemate, it's the one thing that doesn't seem to be static in the case of Northern Ireland. And so that seems to move the agenda forward, whether people want to move it forward or not. I know that's a very insufficient answer to the question. And on the spikes in conflict, I don't think... If you accept as legitimate my notion of ontological security, and if we can talk about these as ontological conflicts, then there really is no distinction between soldiers and citizens anymore. And I think this is what, for instance, the Balkan conflicts taught us, is that basically everybody who is associated with the other groups becomes part of the enemy. And this is what we see in Darfur. This is what we see in Rwanda. And I think so. This distinction between soldier and citizen becomes increasingly difficult to make, because invariably, especially the side that seems to be the hegemonic side, it seems to label everyone else as the problem. This is, of course, not particularly intelligent by states, because what you do is you radicalize the entire minority group, and then they take up arms, and everybody indeed does become a soldier, which is exactly what you didn't want to have to happen in the first place.
Well, this is just to follow that up. That's. Sorry, pass it over here.
Oh, sorry.
I guess the point is that that's a fair enough point, but it's not reflected in what you're showing us here, and I'll have to get back to the other point because I'm blanking on it. But that's if you actually include the number of civilian deaths that have been caused through, I mean, I remember one story that was related to me about somebody asking a minister in an African country, "What do you think about the conflict going on in the north of your country?" And he says, "We have no conflict. We do, however, have a lot of armed bandits running around killing people." That's exactly the sort of thing that's not falling within this extremely narrow definition of armed conflict. So while you can say that there is a decreasing differentiation between the definition of soldier and the definition of civilian as civilians become targeted, and the profile of a soldier worldwide is increasingly a 12-year-old with a rifle, this does not fall within any accepted definitions of soldier, and yet you were forced to deal with it. Again, there are two very different sets of numbers that are going to be represented here, and what I'm seeing is only one of them in this. So that's where the question is going.
I concur with the comment, and I think that's a nuance that we need to work on a lot better. I think this is partially why I was kind of trying to move away from these pure sort of rigid numerical scientific definitions of so and so many battle deaths in order to qualify something as a conflict. So I entirely agree with your concern, your criticism.
Okay. I think there's a couple questions up along this table side.
Charles Teller from Public Health Institute. In demography, you might want to consider another variable that is maybe more important in conflict than either growth or composition. And you have indirectly alluded to it, but it is distribution. And USAID is focusing a lot more now on Africa, and having resided in one of the most conflict-ridden Horn of Africa. When you look at the five countries, you mentioned Rwanda, but if we are looking at some of the bigger countries that are where there is a lot of ethnic tribal conflict, and it may be more tribal than ethnic, distribution is really important. One is because the leaders, the autocrats, are often from a minority region or minority tribe, and they try to control the majority. How do they control them? They divide and conquer. They keep them down on the rural areas. You can control them a lot better in the rural areas, and you restrict their access to land and jobs. If they migrate to the urban areas, that's a problem, particularly if they migrate and they settle among like-minded opposition groups. If they settle in their Sadr cities, or they settle in their Gojamvaranda or Somali Terra, then there really are problems. So I think that you really have to consider concentration and distribution and the dynamic of migration. If you measure migration better and the selectivity of migration, I think you'll see it related to the conflict. And just a quick point on demographic data. I'm not sure that political scientists can throw stones, because I think the demographic data is often grounded in biological necessity or reality. And so that's why demographers can do projections. I don't think that political scientists with their data can do as good a projection as the demographers. The censuses are highly standardized in many countries. It is true that in some of the war-torn countries it's not. But you have countries like Cote d'Ivoire that has very good demographic data, even though it's in a civil war, so does other countries. But anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, and up to Scott here.
Yeah, Thank you. I'm Scott Radloff from USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. And I think, Monica, you started to answer this question already, but my first question was whether whether you're able to break out the ethnic group that was in power between the minority and majority ethnic group. And then I was also trying to figure out the problem. One of the problem cases you said was when the minority group is decreasing in population, and just trying to understand when that would happen. And I think it would happen either when they're in power or or higher educated. Usually it's a higher educated, more urban, higher income ethnic groups that experience the transition earlier. So they would be decreasing in size. So that would happen, I think, either when the minority was in power or had economic dominance in the society, or if there was outmigration. And I guess the other question, is whether you're able to distinguish between whether the decrease in an ethnic group size was because of natural increase or in or outmigration.
Mm-hmm. I'll start with Charles. I hope that you don't think I was throwing stones at demographers. I actually envy their work, and at some points in my career I wish I had been a demographer, because I agree with you. Politics is so idiosyncratic. A leader comes in, she's got particular ideas, and they change the system, right? Whereas you're right, it's a biological, you want to say imperative, but people have